Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the 2010 Aspen Environment Forum. My name is David Monsma. I am the Executive Director of the Aspen Institute's Energy and Environment Program. This forum is presented by the Aspen Institute and by our wonderful partners at National Geographic. The forum is also sponsored by Chevrolet, Shell, and Duke Energy. Here to start tonight's session, this evening's session, is Chris Johns. He's the Editor-in-Chief of National Geographic magazine. Please welcome Chris Johns.
Thank you, David. On behalf of the National Geographic Society, I'd like to welcome all of you. I'm just happy to be out of Washington, D.C., probably the hottest place in North America. And I'm very happy that we won't have to deal with travel changes with snow this year, David. So it's great to be here. We look forward to the conversations. I would like to thank several people from the National Geographic Society who were instrumental in putting the panels and the content for those panels together. And that's Dennis Dimmick from National Geographic Magazine, Sarah Laskin from National Geographic Mission Programs. I'd also like to thank the writers, reporters, photographers, explorers, and all the people from the National Geographic Society who are here for the next few days for these conversations with us. I thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedules to come to Aspen. I would also like to thank David, Walter, and everyone from the Aspen Institute. You're terrific partners, and it is a pleasure to be here regardless of the weather. Tonight, for just a minute, I'd like to talk about two men who exemplify the values, the core values of the National Geographic Society and the Aspen Institute. Wes Skiles was an explorer, an extraordinary explorer, talented cameraman, filmmaker, and had an insatiable curiosity. He was focused on the world's oceans and was a highly experienced diver. Sadly, somehow he was involved in a diving accident last week, and he won't be with us Tuesday night. However, Tuesday night we'll have a screening of Wes's film. He did the cover story for National Geographic magazine for the August issue on Bahamas blue holes, and Wes will be terribly missed by all of us. In 1970, a man was inspired by Earth Day, Stephen Henry Schneider. He dedicated his life to the environment in 1970 on Earth Day. As many of you know, he was flying from Sweden on a plane into London and passed away on that airplane. He crossed paths with National Geographic magazine in 1976 and 1977 as we were doing a cover story called Unlocking the Climate Puzzle. It was one of the first stories done by a major publication on global climate change. And interestingly enough, we'd been working on this story for 2 years, and Stephen had been one of our foremost consultants on this story. But as often happens in publishing, there was a disagreement about this story, an intense debate about the direction of this story. The writer had fallen into the camp of the global climate change skeptics. The photography side of our magazine had come to the other side and had relied very heavily on Stephen's work. It came down to the research department. The research department had to really settle an argument that spoke to the very core values of the National Geographic Society. For more than 120 years, We funded expeditions and funded science throughout the world. We had to get this story right, and the climate change story had to be grounded in solid science. So they went to Dr. Schneider, and out of all the people they talked to, and believe me, our research department talks to a lot of people, he was the voice that rang with absolute clarity, thoughtfulness, in explaining to us why the skeptics were wrong, why this global climate change was an issue that each and every one of us in this room should be concerned about. He kept National Geographic magazine from looking like a bunch of fools. And, of course, we're eternally grateful for that. In the spirit of Wes and in the spirit of Stephen, their spirit will be with us the next few days. What I'd like to do now is introduce Walter Isaacson. Walter will talk about something very dear to Wes's in Stephen's heart, and that's what's going on in the Gulf. So thank you, Walter.
Thank you, Chris. Appreciate it. Thank you, and thanks to all your people at National Geographic. It's absolutely wonderful to be partnering with National Geographic on this most important topic. I want to just speak for 60 seconds or so about my hometown, New Orleans, and about Louisiana, because we've been on the front lines of everything you worry about when it comes to the environment. First with Katrina, then the oil spill, and climate change. And we're rebuilding that city higher, drier, and much smarter. But the person, I think, who is most responsible for getting New Orleans back on track and being a hero of New Orleans is Scott Cowen, the president of Tulane. And that's why I asked him to moderate this panel. It's been great for New Orleans, great for Scott, but also great for Tulane, which now had 44,000 applicants this year for its 1,400 spots, which is a record because of the type of service that Tulane has been providing and the fact that people really want to go there now. Among the things that Scott Cowen is doing, he's been asked to help figure out the coastal restoration academic pieces of the puzzle. Had dinner with Lisa Jackson and Ray Mabus to do it. So it's once again Scott throwing himself into the breach and helping on a crisis. I will say of Lisa, she knows of Scott because she too is a Tulane graduate. Chemical engineering, yes. And Lisa Jackson is one of my heroes too. Grew up in the Gentilly part of New Orleans. Went to Tulane and then a school in New Jersey, Princeton, I think it was, for graduate work. Became basically the Environmental Protection Agency of New Jersey's director and is now in President Obama's cabinet as the EPA director of the United States. And one other quick shout out from your neighborhood in Gentilly, Wendell grew up too. And Wendell Pierce, you know, I worked with him as a neighborhood activist, and then late one night on a bar in Frenchman Street about a month and a half ago, I saw Wendell, and it was DBA, I think, and all of a sudden you weren't Wendell Pierce anymore, you were Antoine Baptiste, you were playing in role. Wendell, as you know, is the star of Treme, was the star of The Wire, but he went back to their old neighborhood to make sure it worked. Scott, over to you. Thank you so much for doing it, sir.
Good, thank you, Walter. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very proud and pleased to be here in Aspen, especially this time of year, given the temperature in New Orleans, to moderate this panel. I also want to thank Walter for his kind words. I have one prerequisite. Whenever I'm introduced anywhere in America, I always ask for Walter, and you now know why. He's very kind. You know, in the last 5 years, the Gulf Coast, and especially Louisiana, has gone through 3 incredible shocks. Historic and unprecedented, and all man-made. Katrina, the economic downturn, which we all shared in common, and of course the oil spill. And in about 6 weeks from now, if you can believe it, we'll be commemorating the 50th anniversary of Katrina. And just as we're doing that, we're dealing with the oil spill. But as Walter said, and I would reiterate, There's not a person in New Orleans who is not optimistic and hopeful about the future of our city and our state. Why? We have already been tested many times. We have shown we are resilient, and we will overcome anything that comes our way, including this oil spill. But it seems very apropos, and one of the reasons why I was delighted to moderate this panel tonight is because it is a subject that's near and dear to my heart, and quite honestly should be near and dear to all of you. And we have 4 exceptional people here tonight to address a number of issues. I'm going to start out with a conversation with Lisa, which you can eavesdrop on. We're friends, we're going to talk about a number of subjects. When Lisa and I are finished, I'm going to open the floor up only for 2 questions to Lisa. And when we finish that, I'm going to ask our other guests to come on up, and then I'm going to ask some questions of each one of them from their unique perspective of this oil spill, both its short and long-term impact. And I will leave at least 15 minutes at the end where you can all ask questions of anyone you want to. Lisa, first of all, it's good to see you again. Lisa and I had dinner in New Orleans about a week ago, and if you're from New Orleans, the first thing you talk about is, what did you have for dinner? Yeah. So I will skip the menu that we had for dinner, other than to say that Lisa picked out the appetizers, and they were exquisite. Enough about food. Lisa, let's start with the immediacy of the oil spill. When you heard about the incident itself, how did you mobilize the EPA to respond?
You know, the rig actually collapsed on Earth Day. That's beginning to be part of the jargon, but it wasn't in the very beginning. And on Earth Day, my PR staff were extremely proud of themselves because they had landed me time on the David Letterman show, an EPA administrator in prime time, prime network, whatever, nighttime TV. And so I was in Manhattan. So the president called a meeting of his cabinet, maybe I think around 3 or 4 that afternoon, and I was already in Manhattan. So Bob Perciasepi, who many of you know, many years at the Audubon Society before that EPA went to the initial meetings. EPA stood up its Emergency Operations Center and began to do what it does by law, which is support the Coast Guard on a response at sea. If an oil spill happens out at sea in the coastal zone, the lead agency by law is the U.S. Coast Guard. If the same spill happens on land, then the lead agency would be, or in the inland part of the United States, the lead agency would be EPA. And so we have a long history of working together. Recall that on Earth Day, even then, there weren't really any questions because at that point it was still a life-saving operation and it was unknown. And actually BP was saying at the time that they didn't believe there was any leak of oil into the Gulf of Mexico. The main leak was thought to be the tanks that were on the rig that collapsed into the Gulf. My thinking was air sampling, water sampling, sediment samples. Our first sampling events took place within that week, that first week of the collapse, because I knew that as this thing evolved, it wouldn't just be the oil, which at that point was still pretty far out into the Gulf, but the response, every response method that people would want data to determine whether or not human health was being protected in the short term.
What will be the EPA's role in the recovery now from this spill, both in the short term and longer term?
Well, first off, I grew up in New Orleans. I think everybody knows that here. So I have a particular vested interest to make sure that our role is robust in a couple of ways. First is something we talked about earlier, that the people of the Gulf are resilient and want to take care of themselves. In fact, as we've both seen over the past weeks, a lot of the criticism is just get out of our way. We feel as though there's more we can be doing. And there is a lingering distrust of government because of the Gulf hurricanes, Katrina and Rita after it. And so there is a need for EPA to be there to constantly look at community involvement. We've done some wonderful work with Tulane, another plug, on community involvement, working with the NGO community to ensure they have a voice at the table. But when people think of EPA now, they think mainly of all of our air sampling, all online, all since early in the response. A lot of work in reviewing coastal restoration ideas that have come up. There's been lots of attention paid to sand berms and rock jetties, but there have been probably 36 smaller projects along the coast that EPA has reviewed for the Corps of Engineers along with other parts of the federal government to approve that. and waste disposal, which is always an issue. People don't think about it at first, but this response is generating a tremendous amount of waste. People want to know where it's going. They want to know that it's tested. They want to make sure that it's going to, it's not hazardous. It doesn't display a hazardous characteristic if it's going to go into a non-hazardous landfill, basically.
What likely is to be the EPA's longer-term role in the Gulf Coast because of this?
Well, I hope that there are a couple of really big picture, long-term things that come out of it. Lesson number one, we've been monitoring air since April 28th, and we've had several days where the air is not safe or healthy. It has nothing to do with the spill or the burning or any of the things you see. It has to do with the fact that air quality in the Gulf region is not good. We see that with some of the water quality sampling that we're taking. We don't see anything from the spill, but we see some long-term concerns to aquatic health in the water sampling. So I hope our long-term role will be to continue to have funding, to continue to get sampling data to show people the breadth of environmental issues that the Gulf faces, not to minimize this spill, which is going to be its own set of issues, certainly for the Gulf environment, the marine environment, but to keep a focus on the human health and environmental impacts of the spill. And also I hope to really relook at preparedness, because EPA has a pretty big role in preparedness under the National Contingency Plan, which is clearly something that was lacking before the spill.
You know, you had a complex issue of coordinating not only with other federal agencies, but with BP and the state. That cannot have been the easiest task. So tell us, how effective has that coordination played out, both with the state and with BP?
I'm happy to, but one more long-term task is Gulf Coast restoration, which is right in front of us, and I think absolutely critical for us to use this moment to turn everyone's attention back to that working waterfront, that working coastline, but the need for us to live in harmony with that river system and with our wetlands. So EPA will be there and has been there in the past. I'm really looking forward to using my role in my bully pulpit to ensure that certainly the Gulf Coast interests are brought to the fore. Now, you asked about BP and the state. I have a history as an environmental enforcer. So I think one of the things EPA can do is get real data, because we have learned over the course of this response that BP's responsiveness and sometimes their answers are not always accurate and are not always complete. I have been fond of saying there's a level of arrogance there that's not matched by performance. You know, there seems to be some need to have the government really question and add real value. I think there's been real value added not just by EPA, but by the federal response, which has been very robust. And you know, our dealings with the state, we have a relationship with every state, because most of the environmental programs that we implement are actually implemented through the states. So when we talk about solid waste or hazardous waste or air sampling or water sampling, most of that is being done either in conjunction with or in partnership. So we build on the state monitoring network under the Clean Air Act, and we add to it. Or the water monitoring that they're doing at the State Fish and Wildlife, we add to that. Solid waste is much the same.
If there have been any conflicts between the federal government, BP, and the state, are you at liberty to share with us what those conflicts have been?
Yeah, sure. You know, the main conflicts, I think, with the state, and this is tough, is over the nature of what constitutes the right response early on. And it reminded me so much of hurricane preparedness. When I was little, Camille was coming. I don't remember Betsy. I was too young. I have vague memory. But Camille was coming. I remember my father just whipping himself into a frenzy, because the longer you have to think something's coming, the worse it is when you realize you're not ready for it. And I think the people of the Gulf, there was some of that desperation and frustration in some of the initial actions. And so some of our conflicts were Louisianians who came up to me and said, well, you're going to approve this or that plan I have. And I said, listen, we're going to evaluate it from an environmental standpoint. Most of our dealings with Louisiana have been absolutely fine. But I do hope that out of what comes here is a recognition on the part of Louisianians that environmental protection and, yes, regulation in general and oversight is really important. Because I think up until this point, the state has been willing sometimes to turn the other way when there are problems related to air quality or water quality or wetlands, which the state really hasn't regulated very effectively. And it's not one politician's fault, and it's happened over decades.
As you reflect on what happened, and this case is still playing out, obviously, the oil leak, and will for a long time, what are the 2 or 3 major lessons that we should be taking away from this? Lessons that might be germane to the EPA, might be germane to oil and gas companies, germane to the community. Whatever there's a tragedy, there has to be some good that comes out of it, because we learn from it, and we grow, and we create opportunity. So what are the lessons learned here, and what are the opportunities?
I think the first lesson is actually a very, very basic one, which is that the role of government at its most basic is protection. And environmental protection doesn't happen by itself. It happens through the oversight, through the, oh, have you not been able to hear me the whole time?
It's all right.
You heard me? Oh, good. That would be pretty funny, because I thought you were enthralled on
I told him it was a conversation between the two of us. Right.
Yeah. I really think it goes back to, we had become a little complacent here. We had sort of come to the place where we believe that corporate responsibility, and there are responsible corporations out there, was enough. And I firmly believe that it isn't enough, that the role of, it's not an accident protection is in the EPA's name, because it's not unlike the Department of Defense and our very security. We cannot be healthy if we do not have clean air to breathe. We cannot be happy or have well-being if we don't have water to drink. I mean, it sustains our lives if we don't have a healthy ecosystem around us. And we need to be reminded of that. I think BP, on the heels of what was a horrible tragedy in West Virginia, 29 miners who lost their lives, we need to be reminded that there needs to be a side of government, that there is a role for government in overseeing corporate actions and ensuring that the public welfare is not one of the pieces of price that we pay as a country in order for them to make a profit. And I'm as much of a capitalist and a free market person as anyone else, but we are a guard post. EPA and any environmental regulation has to be a guard post. I hope we remember that, because I think we had gotten to the point where we almost believed we could do without it. And I don't think the American people are ready for that. You know, I don't think we're there yet. Hopefully one day we'll have a society where corporate responsibility and sustainability is all we need, but I don't think we're there yet.
You know, with the benefit of hindsight in your role as administrator of the EPA, as you look back over the last 90 plus days or so, is there anything you wished you had done differently?
Personally done differently. You know, there were days when I just wished I moved into New Orleans and just stayed on the Gulf Coast for 90 days, but I do have another job some of the time. I think it still goes back to preparedness. You know, EPA prepares its schedule under the National Contingency Plan for dispersants. We have had to run tests on dispersants that have never been run before. That shouldn't have been the case. EPA prepares the guidelines for public input into response planning. And we now know that the public feels as though they didn't have a real role in getting ready for not just the public at large, but local governments. Maybe a larger role is needed there. We're going to have to change all those regulations. And I think in general, we're going to have to look at a response planning network. We're certainly going to want everybody to go back and look at the current plans they have in place and make them better, because we know that we're not ready for at least some category of catastrophic failure out there.
You know, as someone who's been in New Orleans for a while myself, and a New Orleanian yourself, when Katrina happened, we really had very hard feelings towards the federal government, how it was handled. And because of the oil spill, there's a residue of, there's still hard feelings because of the way the federal government. Do you think that's a fair assessment? I mean, you can't argue with the way people feel, but the fact is, do you think the federal government did what they were supposed to do?
In the BP incident, I absolutely do. And that's from seeing it from the inside. And this is from someone who's probably as cynical as any Gulf Coast resident. I think you know, my mom lost her home in Pontchartrain Park, right where Wendell's doing such extraordinary work. And you know, for me, when that happened, it was 2005, 5, and I was really going to leave government because I felt like, you know, I've given my life to this thing called public service, but if at the end of the day government can't provide basic support to people in that kind of dire need, what am I doing? And I went through a lot of soul searching. I thought about moving back home, and I didn't, because I came to believe that there is good that government can do, and that we had to fix it. We couldn't just all walk away from it. I feel as though this response has been a very different government response. It has not been perfect. People aren't perfect. And clearly the law needs to focus on who is in command in a unified command structure. When does a unified command structure not make sense? But I think people overlook the fact that the president from very early on understood that, and therefore appointed a national incident commander and realized that there was a need to treat this differently than all the other oil spills that do happen in the Gulf and around the country. And all of that, I think, will be told over time. I don't think the government should defend its actions. It should learn from them.
President Obama tasked Secretary Mabus to develop a long-term recovery plan for the Gulf Coast. What does that mean? I mean, what really is his time frame? What is the sort of the content and substance of this supposed to be?
So, well, you know, from our wonderful dinner, part of the reason we wanted to make sure Ray Mabus had a good dinner was so he would leave happy. It's a secret New Orleans trick, right? But the president has tasked him with really looking at the next level. We have to respond to the well. Right now it's capped. We have to respond to the oil that's already in the Gulf. We have to respond to the oil that has already hit the shores and that will hit the shores. But then there's the next level. There's all the work that so many people in academia, in private sector, at NGOs have done around thinking about what would make a sustainable, healthy, resilient Gulf Coast. Not just New Orleans, right? But the entire Gulf Coast. And so Ray has actually got two areas of focus. He has to look at environmental coastal restoration. And I told him, as you did, you know, he's got a great head start. He's got a lot of crib sheets out there. There's a lot of work that's been done. And then he's got to look at economic resiliency. And we all see a Gulf Coast that is very dependent on two big industries. They're not exclusively, but oil and seafood/tourism. And what other legs can you put on that stool to try to make sure that that region of the country is not hit, that one thing can't take out two legs of, you know, of two pillars of the economy. So I think he's looking at both. I think he said 60 to 90 days, so he's looking to give the president a report. And I do think that having him be from Mississippi, a former governor, is a wonderful opportunity for the Gulf Coast to speak and be heard.
As you look forward as administrator of the EPA, is there going to be more regulation now? Is there going to be more enforcement? Is there going to be both? So what's going to happen to regulation? What's going to happen to enforcement as a result of what happened here?
Well, first, I hope we look at them all and decide what was smart and what wasn't. There hasn't been a lot of funding of research on most of the response methods and on making sure that the response methods have kept up with the incredible technological innovation on the drilling and extraction side. I don't know that you need lots and lots of regulation. I think it's been pretty well publicized that you need to enforce the permitting and enforcement mechanisms that are already on the books. And that may mean some amount of resources. We also have to ensure that there's checks and balances in the system. I don't think that you can expect that one entity can permit and enforce and do it all alone. There are equities that have to be balanced in any extractive industry, and certainly when you're trying to decide whether to give a permit, preparedness may not be something that you want to put in the hands of the same person putting the permit. And since I have to do this, we embattled government officials have to always recognize one of our own, and we have an extraordinary one here, Secretary Bruce Babbitt. So I just want to thank him for all his service and leadership on these issues.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Lisa, one more question for you before I go out to the audience.
Before it storms.
You've been in the job about a year now.
Year and a half.
And of course, you never sign up for these things, no more than I signed up for Katrina, but stuff happens.
Yep.
What has happened has probably shaped your view of what you feel you now need to get accomplished as administrator of the EPA. So how has this reordered your priorities, your vision for what you want to get accomplished, your instructions from the president. It's got to have some impact on how you're going to spend the next 12 months, 24 months, whatever it is that you're there as EPA administrator.
You know something I don't know?
I was going to keep going and going, but I figured, I don't want to get too much in trouble here.
I have to say, one of the coolest things about working in the environmental field is that, first off, you have to be an optimist to do it. And you have to be an optimist all the time. And so I can't, I'm also a religious person, so I have had many a time when I think, what am I here for? And I think the only answer is it reinforces to me the importance of what we do. The importance of trying to be a voice to the American people, a science-based voice for their own protection. And, I could quibble about any one piece and any one lesson, but clean air has never been more important. Clean water has never been more important. Toxic chemicals in our products and in our bodies, never more important. And so for me, it's really just been a realization that with all the complexities and all the hard times that we all go through, and certainly in honor of the people who died and the people in the Gulf who are exhausted, we owe them our best. And so kind of a simple lesson, but a really cool one.
I'll tell you, if this was ever going to happen, which it did, I can't think of a better person, especially from New Orleans, that we'd rather have in the job than you. I'll tell you that. All right, I'd like to have 2 questions, and I'm just going to, there are probably more than that, but 2 right now. And we have microphones here, so make sure you get a microphone. So one in the back right there, and one in the middle right on this side. So get microphones as soon as you have them. And what I would ask is, no speeches, just questions.
Serge Dedina, Executive Director of Wild Coast, Costa Salvaje. I work in U.S.-Mexico border in Mexico. Have you thought about how we can use this to improve our partnerships with Mexico, given Congress's cutting of your significant budget for your Mexico work? And I want to congratulate EPA on its historic work in Mexico, and I want to figure out how we can work to support the great work you and your team are doing in Mexico and get more funding for that, given what could be catastrophic impacts from this oil spill on Mexico and resource-dependent communities.
Sure, great idea, great suggestion. And yeah, I have thought about it, but not as obviously as well as you have. There's 2 interesting pieces to our relationship with Mexico. The only spill that's in any way comparable to the BP gusher is the Bay of Campeche, the Ixtoc 1979 spill. Huge amounts of oil closer to shore, not in deep water, and many of the same issues there. So our counterparts in Mexico have been very forthcoming about information on that spill and information about what happened as a result. A lot of what we know about the Gulf's ability to deal with oil, which is miraculous. It's not foolproof, but it is amazing how resilient that system can be, is from that spill and from our counterparts there, as well as our friends at NOAA who've done a lot of study there. And now, of course, the tables are turned and we have the same issue. I'll be going down to Mexico in the next couple of weeks. That'll be something that we'll talk about there, because we do have a government in Mexico that is never more aware of the importance of not just those issues, but all the issues around NAFTA, all the issues around our border with Mexico, where there are still significant issues of just sanitation, water and clean water and wastewater treatment. So I think it does provide yet another opportunity for us to realize this North American continent, that Mexico has become a significant player and a potential significant ally.
The other question, please.
Mark Gold, another Southern California environmental group, Heal the Bay. Administrator, I was just wondering, you must have had a lot of discussions over the last 3 months on whether or not to declare the Gulf an emergency area, with all the various different flexibility that one gets from declaring an emergency, as well as from the standpoint of potential funding, moving around the hierarchy, and who's making what decision, and those sorts of things. What was the outcome of those discussions, and how come that decision wasn't made, considering it's such an enormous environmental crisis for the United States?
Well, I think that there's a lot still to be determined in terms of the ultimate response. I think, first, the National Incident Command structure, the idea that this became a spill of national significance was, I think, very, very good news for the Gulf. very, very early on. The $20 billion has now been put up by BP is unprecedented in this country. And no matter what you think of a lot of the things the federal government has done, I don't think that anyone can look at the idea that we knew we needed to get more than BP's word that they were going to pay for something up front. The idea of a claims process and an independent claims negotiator, all really first-time ideas for use in an oil spill response, all borrowed from things that work in other contexts. There have been discussions about where next to go in terms of the long-term Gulf recovery. And I don't think anything's off the table, but I do think that what the president would certainly weigh, and it's certainly not my decision, it has to come out of FEMA and the Department of Homeland Security, is what the extra benefits would be. When we talk about hurricane response, lots of talk about the Stafford Act and other opportunities, but I don't know that the discussion's closed on that yet.
Good, thank you for your questions. I'd like to invite the other panelists to come up and join us now.
Are we moving?
No, we're still.
Live. Okay.
Great, thanks.
Hey. How are you?
We're joined today by three other distinguished guests. To my immediate right is Joe Bourne. Joe is contributing writer for National Geographic. No, I'm sorry, you switched spots with him. Okay, I'm sorry. I meant all the way to my right. Joe Bourne is a contributing writer for National Geographic. He's a former senior editor for The Environment, and he's covered just about every major oil spill there has been in recent times. Next to him is Wendell Pierce. Wendell is an actor and founder of the Pontchartrain Park Neighborhood Association. We all know Wendell from TV, but what you also ought to know is, as Walter was talking about heroes of Katrina, Wendell is one of those heroes. Wendell never forgot his roots in New Orleans, and he has given back an awful lot to our community, and I am very thankful for Wendell for that. And our other speaker is John Hollowell, who is Executive Vice President, Deepwater of the Shell Upstream Americas. John is no stranger to Louisiana or the Gulf Coast. As a matter of fact, he is a New Orleanian himself right now. I want to start with Wendell. Wendell, talk to us a little bit as a New Orleanian and someone who's gone through the Katrina experience. What has been the impact of this oil spill on the people of Louisiana, especially on the Gulf Coast? The impact economically, psychologically, emotionally. You know, you could probably read that as well as anybody else because of who you are and your knowledge of our state.
Well, I think one of the things that that we realize right off the bat, especially after going through that 1-2 punch of Katrina and the recession, is the fact that we know by example, the fact that we've been going through it, that we are a resilient people, that we knew that we would be able to prepare ourselves to deal with the response to this oil spill and the effect it would have on our communities and the economy of our communities. We knew that we had that resilience. And while the country and the world may have Katrina fatigue, imagine how we feel. Okay, so you may be tired of hearing about the disasters that are hitting us one after another. We are more than tired. But the one thing you find out in crisis is the character of the nature of people. And the one thing that I'm the proudest of being a New Orleanian and a resident of South Louisiana is we have shown the world our character, our resilience, and that we are prepared to do anything possible to protect our homes, our livelihoods, and our environment. Now, there are those people who say, why rebuild New Orleans after Katrina? Or maybe we should just give up on that area. Well, there was something that was said in the show Treme that was very important in the first episode. We had a character who actually was questioned by a reporter in that same manner, and he said, what great nation doesn't rebuild its great cities? What great nation doesn't rebuild its great cities? I would even go further and say, what great nations don't rebuild the great cities that have an impact on the world? And so with that in mind, whether you agree with it or not, we will rebuild New Orleans better than it was. We will have a response to this oil spill and make it a place where it's safe, where we have a synergy of purpose, where we can share in this environment with energy companies. Duke and Shell are a part of this because I'm sure they have that same purpose. I feel as though that we're going to have the synergy of ideas to make that happen. Now, why am I here? I am a part of the synergy of execution, of taking that purpose and putting it into action. Pontchartrain Park Community Development Corporation is the exact name of the organization that I started, along with the neighborhood association that I resurrected. The Community Development Corporation came out of Pontchartrain Park, a neighborhood that was created in the 1950s in response to the civil rights movement. My parents and their generation were allowed only in the parks of New Orleans on Wednesdays, Negro Day. And so in response to that, even though it was a part of Separate but Equal, they set aside 200 acres for African Americans to participate in the American dream of purchasing a home post-World War II. My father fought in Saipan and came back with a lot of the people who had participated in the war and exercised the GI Bill so they can get a home. What started out as an ugly situation in Jim Crow, set aside to build this separate African-American community, actually became one of the most stable neighborhoods in America, 97% home ownership. It was an incubator of talent, demonstrated here by our great director, Lisa Jackson, who I grew up with. Mayors came out of that, great military leaders. My brother went to West Point. We have members of Annapolis, the Naval Academy, who were also there. So it was a place that I knew talent, it was an incubator of great talent. So when I went back to start this organization a couple of years ago, I realized, why was Pontchartrain Park so slow to return? It was because my parents' generation is 80 years old now. They didn't have that resilience then. They were elderly. They didn't have the empowerment. And I thought it was on my generation to step up to the plate, to exercise our right of self-determination and come back. But the one thing I said was, we're not just going to rebuild Pontchartrain Park without a vision for the future. And that vision for the future is a part of the solution to the oil spill, which is we wanted reusable energy solutions, 21st century solutions as we rebuild our neighborhood. So what we have done in our development corporation is develop homes along with the community so they would have input, meeting new basic flood elevations, hurricane resistance, more importantly, geothermal and solar systems in place, affordable, tangible energy solutions that are not prototype. It is a part of a large-scale redevelopment. This is comparable to what Greensburg, Kansas did after they were torn out by a tornado, said, we're going to come back completely green. We're beyond green. We use a typical home in Pontchartrain Park, the new homes that we're putting up, 20 barrels of oil in a year, as opposed to other homes that are using upwards of 105 barrels of oil in a year. That is the way to have a response, a tangible response to the oil spill, and say that while I know we can coexist, we have to find ways to implement new reusable energy systems and output so that we are not solely dependent on just an addiction to fossil fuels. I'm proud of the fact that we put that on the table. It is what people are doing. When you have a crisis and a dysfunction, we can scream and shout and bitch and complain all we want, but if we don't put our words into action, then we have failed. The best contribution, I tell my community this all the time, the only thing you control is your contribution to a dysfunctional paradigm. So what is your answer and response going to be? Look in the mirror, decide what it is, have a synergy of purpose, and then a synergy of action.
There are at least two wonderful things about Wendell. One is the content of his talk. The second is he answered every question I was going to answer him in the monologue. And he didn't even have a script. But I wrote down some others, Wendell, so you're not quite off, one or two more. As a New Orleanian, what do you expect out of BP and the federal government as part of the recovery effort? What is it that you think that BP should, and I'm not talking in the immediate term, long term, and the federal government, what is it that they should be doing to assist the Gulf Coast area, our state, to recover long term?
I think it's very important that, contrary to what others in my city and our city believed, I was a supporter of the moratorium because I thought 6 months to really make sure safety protocol was in place was not a long time to wait. Especially when other drilling operations were not going to be affected, that they were going to continue. I understand that those men and women who were a part of that sector, the oil business, had jobs that had to be answered, and I thought that the $20 billion that they set aside would answer that. So if you had an answer to the jobs, I'd really appreciate that. I'd appreciate that fund, the $20 billion fund from BP. I know for a fact that BP is going to be committing even more resources after the cap of the spill to make sure that, you know, they are there long term. I feel as though we have to find solutions, and I'm in complete agreement with the director to make sure that those that we ease that fear of regulation. That this is the time that the government is there to protect us. I actually believe that we should look for common ground. I think that we have an opportunity in Louisiana now. We're the second largest state producing sugarcane. That we should look at the example that Brazil has and see the opportunities of making a sugarcane ethanol, you know, sector grow in Louisiana as a solution to not just going into the ocean, but actually utilizing the architecture, the agriculture that's already there and that's prevalent in Louisiana, where there's some synergy. There's, the coexistence of agriculture and finding that ethanol solution, so the oil companies who have taken the time, energy to do the R&D to go into the sea still have an opportunity to find a sector. I think there's common ground there. I expect them to be corporately responsible. I'm not asking them to give up the free market ideas that they have. I mean, our development corporation, although nonprofit, is a free market enterprise. I understand that. And I believe in that. I believe in economic growth. So I just think that we can find that common ground in those different exploration of different opportunities like the ethanol, sugarcane ethanol, that Brazil actually has exhibited over the past decade. So that's what I would expect from the government, the protection, and from BP to be there long term and work with us to find a common ground so that there's some environmental protection while they also meet their goals.
Good, thanks, Wendell. Joel, you've probably written more than anybody, any reporter, for many years about oil spills all over the world. So you're a resident expert on oil spills generally and their impact on communities. So first of all, educate the audience a little bit about what you've learned generally about oil spills and their impact on the community.
Sure. Well, I can talk about, socioeconomic impacts, as Wendell mentioned, are tremendous, and they're one of the things that are sort of indicative of almost every oil spill. And we know a lot about oil spills because we've been spilling oil virtually since we've been drilling for it. And there are two big lessons I think we've learned from the various studies, some of them very well studied spills, like the Amico Cadiz in France and the Exxon Valdez up in Prince William Sound. And the first is short-term impacts are dramatic and severe. The oil is toxic, it smothers things, it kills things outright, and virtually, that's pretty much the same in virtually every spill. The long-term impacts are less dramatic, more subtle, and harder to tease out in many cases. But what you end up with in some long-term studies, are just this lowering of productivity, where you once had a healthy marsh or healthy estuary, and now it's not quite as good as it used to be. And you've got all these PAHs and things in the environment. The big key is oxygen. Oxygen helps break down oil. Actually, it helps the bacteria that are abundant in the Gulf of Mexico, thankfully, break down oil. When you don't have oxygen in a mud marsh sediment or under a rocky shale beach like up in the Exxon Valdez, it hangs around forever. And I went down and looked at some of the Veracruz reefs off Veracruz, Mexico. We had someone here ask a Mexican question earlier. And you can still find tar mats from Ixtoc 1 30 years ago. And you look at the reef that has the Ixoc tar mat on it, and it's gray, and it's dead, and it's not producing very much. And this is on the sheltered side of the reef. And on the more active side of the reef, where the ocean has had a chance to get to it, and the waves break it up, it's living, it's thriving. You see live corals, you see a lot more fish. So these are localized impacts, but they do persist. And this is one of the things. The last thing I think we've learned is that the public, and I think the American public in particular, has a very short attention span. As soon as they don't see oil, it's all good, right? And so we had Santa Barbara was the big wake-up call in '68. Some of you guys might remember that. And from that, we got a moratorium, and I think that contributed to the founding of EPAs, right? Then in the late 70s, we got Amico Cadiz. We got Ixtoc, which was massive and came up and hit South Padre Island. And we got several of these spills in Galveston that were tremendous, all right? And from that, we learned a lot more about how oil impacts the Gulf, but not a lot of impact in terms of administrative or regulatory change. Then we got the Exxon Valdez 10 years later, right? And that was another catastrophe. And from that, we got Ocean Protection Act of '90, I think. It mandated some of these response, Oil Pollution Act. So it mandates some of these response vessels that were on hand at the time. We got, I think, double hull tankers maybe out of that as well, right? And then we forgot about it. And so here we are, 10 years later, and we're dealing with another blowout, another oil spill. And this one in particular is interesting. It's the first deep water spill. And honestly, this is the thing that the scientists that I interview are really petrified about. You know, is what happens in the deep part of the Gulf. This is one of the most productive bodies of water in the world. And oxygen there is very limited. So we've just dumped millions of tons of carbon into this system where oxygen is very limited and it doesn't get churned a lot from the surface. And so suddenly the zooplankton and all the carbon, not zooplankton, but the bacteria are eating up the oil, using up the oxygen. So the fear is that you get these dead zones, these hypoxic zones that nothing could live in that just persist. Because whenever you lose oxygen, the oil sticks around and just stays. So this spill is unique in that regard. And again, it's part of our short-term memory loss because we as a people encourage the companies to go into deep water with a Deepwater Royalty Relief Act in 1995. So we said, okay, you don't have to pay royalty for a certain amount of time. If you drill over 1,000 feet, have at it. And yet, we didn't have the institutions in place, we didn't have the regulators in place, we didn't have the response in place to handle deep water spill. And I think that's obvious.
You know, what's your perception, Joel, from your experience about how long it will take the Gulf Coast region to recover from this, economically and ecologically?
Well, this is really interesting. When I went down there and talked to the fishermen down in a little fishing village that got heavily oiled during Ixtoc, they were still, I mean, these were men in their 50s and 60s who remembered the spill. They said it took 10 to 15 years before their fisheries returned to normal. Some of the researchers, you know, corroborated that as well. And at the end of that, there were only a third of the fishermen they had from the village from when it started. Now, some of the species come back quick. Apparently, the shrimp fishery in the Bay of Campeche came back fairly quickly, a couple of years. But the reef fisheries, the fin fisheries, some of the shell fisheries took them forever. Now, you go to the Amico Cadiz spill on the Breton coast. Much different environment in the Gulf. Cold water, shale beaches, very oxygenated, you know, it's the English Channel. They do have a prolific oyster industry in some of their riverine systems. And the researcher I spoke to there said it took them 7 years for the oyster industry to fully recover. So you're looking at long-term impacts not only on ecosystems and species, but also on the people who depend on them.
You know, based on your experiences with oil spills, including this one, what are the 2 or 3 lessons that you have learned that you want to make sure you pass on to others about these spills and how to recover from them? First of all, how to avoid them, and secondly, how to recover from
Well,
them.
the avoiding thing is key because after Exxon Valdez, the Office of Technology Assessment, which is sort of the science arm of Congress, basically looked at the response to the Exxon Valdez and said, they had a huge report on it, said, you know, even if you have a great response, in many of these challenging situations, you're just not going to pick up a lot of oil. And prevention, in these cases, is worth pounds and pounds and pounds and pounds of cure. So prevention is the key. The problem is we fell asleep at the switch. As the oil companies were moving deeper and deeper, the rate of blowouts did not go down. The rate of blowouts has been almost steady since 1970s, right? Not all of them have been catastrophic. The oil industry deals with them fairly regularly on a pretty good basis. But we're still getting them. And one of the things that I learned in talking to some of the people in the Norwegian industry, they had a catastrophic blowout on their oil field in 1985. It's called the West Vanguard blowout. And they drill mostly for gas, and they're one of the major gas suppliers to Europe. So they have shallow water, but it's high temperature, high pressure wells, very dangerous. They had this massive blowout. And immediately, the government, the Statoil company, the unions all got together and decided, how are we going to make this not happen again? And they came out with a number of best practices. It was a goal-oriented system, much different than our sort of prescriptive restriction regulatory system. And they haven't had a blowout since, or a catastrophic blowout. They've had a few small ones. So, how you prevent this from happening, ultimately, it's like Wendell said, we get off oil. And of course, we've had how many presidents promise to get us off oil? 8 or 9. And our imports are still, and they're projected to go even higher over the next 20 years.
One quick question, Joel. You made a statement which we fell asleep at the switch. Who's the we?
Well, I'll give you this example. I interviewed a Coast Guard commander who used to work in the Galveston office, and so I asked him about these MMS inspections. And he said, oh yeah, when I would go out and inspect a rig, I'd be down with my flashlight getting greasy in the big legs and everything. The MMS guy would come out, have lunch, spend 30 minutes and fly away. And he said it was an absolute joke. He didn't want to say that on record. But I think the point is, we had a very cozy relationship between the regulators and the industry. We had lost a lot of the technical expertise in the regulators because, honestly, they're working at government wages. And everybody who's good and can make, money in the oil field is going to go make money in the oil field. And again, I don't think there was the support, and especially in the previous administration, where the focus was on production. And I won't say at all costs, but almost at any cost.
Thank you. John, let me turn to you. And it's not that I purposely left Shell to the end. I want you to know that. I did not, but I wanted you to have the last word on some of these issues. First of all, how critical is deep water drilling to Shell? Put it in context for us about how important this is to your company.
Scott, I would like to say one thing, though. Shell's proud to sponsor this event because it's a great place to have a dialogue just like this. And it's a place where my colleagues and I are here to listen and learn and engage in dialogue. So I think this is really good. To your direct question, the Deepwater Business Unit, which I run for Shell Upstream Americas, is a significant part of the Upstream Americas portfolio. We produce, on total production on all our platforms in deep water is about 400,000 barrels a day. We have over 200 wells and 6 floating structures in the Gulf of Mexico that produce that oil and gas. Now, a little bit broader scheme, though, and what I think is critical to realize is the impact that deep water has on the energy supply chain for the U.S. The Gulf of Mexico supplies roughly 30% of the energy supply into the U.S., and deep water is probably over 80% of that, of the total production from the Gulf of Mexico. And also in terms of jobs, when you think of deep water, roughly 170,000 jobs are involved in the oil and gas industry in the deep water. So deep water is a significant component of Shell's portfolio, and it's important to the U.S., I believe.
I know once again, this incident is still playing out. But what are the 1 or 2 most important preliminary learnings from the recent incident that Shell has taken away from this?
I think that's good. It gets to Joel's comment about prevention. One learning for me is it has confirmed that prevention is indeed key. So Joel, you hit it right on the head. Prevention is key. And prevention, I think, is through well design, well standards, how many barriers you put in the well, how you drill the well to ensure that you have the right number of verifiable barriers in the well to give you the best chance to drill a well safely. That's absolutely critical, and prevention will go further than anything else we can do to prevent another one of these in the Gulf of Mexico. That said, I think also Joel hit the nail on the head. You weren't reading my notes before. No. In well containment, what we have learned, you have seen the video of the well spewing from the wellhead. And we have got to, one of the quick key learnings is how do we get to that faster? And in fact, last week, I don't know if you saw, Shell along with Exxon, Conoco, and Chevron has committed to build a rapid response system to address this issue into the future in the unlikely event that it would occur again. And it'll be a pre-constructed, pre-engineered, very flexible system where we can rapidly respond to an incident if it occurs. But the combination of prevention through robust well design along with rapid response will go a long way to intervening faster and, more importantly, causing less oil from a blowout to get to the surface.
Tell us a little bit more about Shell's philosophy towards safety and prevention, such that we get some comfort that this would not have happened if it were Shell.
Well, I think that's a valid question, Scott. Let me talk a little bit about safety and how it is ingrained at Shell, and I'm very proud of this. I've worked for Shell for close to 31 years. Safety is a value at Shell. It is a value in deep water. The day begins, the day ends with safety. And safety is paramount in the design of a deep water well like this. And at Shell, we have a systematic way in which we go about this that involves really 5 key things. One is global standards. We have drilled a number of these wells across the world, and we have learned how to drill these wells throughout time. And we have put those into global standards so that we drill these wells the same anywhere in the world, number one. Number 2 is robust well design, which includes the design of multiple barriers in the well at each point that you're drilling the well to ensure that oil and gas won't get to the backside of casing. I'm talking technical terms. I can't help but do that. And get to the surface. The third thing, and probably the most important thing, is an HSE case, health, safety, and environmental case. What this is a system by which our drilling contractors identify all the risks that they see in drilling the well to the objective depth. And what are the mitigating factors that we use in order to prevent those risks or mitigate those risks? Shell does the same thing with our own internal health, safety, and environmental management systems. We then come together and integrate those, with the intent being that everybody that works on that rig, drilling that well, is aligned and integrated and understands what the risks are and how to mitigate those risks. And further to that, they have the obligation to stop the job in the event that something doesn't look right. They have the obligation and the responsibility. The fourth thing that we have is rigorous training. Our drilling engineers to drill these kinds of wells, and I'll characterize the Macondo well as a high-pressure, high-temperature, deep-water well, require rigorous training, including credentials, testing, and experience in order to be competent to drill these wells. And the fifth thing that we use in these type of wells is another set of eyes. We have invested in technology where we have a real-time operations center on the beach. We have one in New Orleans, we have one in Houston, we have one in Malaysia, and we have one in Scotland. And any of those locations can look at any well that we're drilling at any time and offer another set of eyes for issues that may come up or problems that may come up. And I believe those 5 things are critical and speak to your question about safety and the importance of safety at Shell.
All right, now let me ask you this. Given this philosophy, which it sounds, I have to say, very impressive and does give comfort, would your system probably have told you you shouldn't have dug that well that the other company did the way they did it?
According to our global standards, Shell would not have drilled the well the way BP did. We would not have drilled the well the way BP did. We would have employed the 5 things I told you, and we would have employed a more robust well design per our global standards.
Talk a little bit about the impact of the moratorium on Shell. You heard Wendell say that generally, I think you said you were in favor of the moratorium, Wendell. From your perspective, what impact is it having on Shell? What are you worried about with the moratorium?
The moratorium is having an impact. To give you an idea, in the deep water, we have really 2 types of equipment we use to drill wells. We have a floating drilling rig. That was the BP Horizon rig. It's a floating drill ship that goes around and drills wells. And we have platform rigs. So the 6 platforms that I told you about each have a rig on it, and they can drill wells. Now, the moratorium on the 4 mobile drilling rigs, 2 of them are now idled and in the shipyard, and the other 2 are on permitted work, soon to be completed, and then will be idled. So we'll have 4 rigs idled. What we're interested in trying to do during the moratorium is keep those rigs in the Gulf of Mexico. We don't want to let them go. Let me tell you why. 2 reasons. One, if they leave, and some have left, they probably won't come back for a very long time. because these rigs are contracted for a number of years when they're contracted. And there's places around the world, Brazil, Nigeria, that are looking for rigs. So once they leave, and 4 or 5 have already left, they won't come back for 4 or 5 years. The second thing is experience, competence, and capability. We want to keep those men and women that work on those rigs in the Gulf because we've worked with them for several years. We've built this safety case together. We understand how each of us want to work, and we want to keep that capability in the Gulf of Mexico. So we're paying rig time while they're here in order to keep that competence and that capability. And it's vital to, I think, a successful future post-moratorium.
I'm going to ask John one more question, then I'm going to open up the rest of you for questions. So, John, what's Shell's investment to alternative energy sources? What are you doing in that area? How much are you investing, and what alternative sources? Because we've talked a lot about that. I think we all share in common that is one of the takeaways from all this. We have got to lower our dependence on oil and gas. So please, go ahead.
If you look long term, and Shell's research suggests that by mid-century, the demand for energy will double what it is today. And to supply that energy, it's going to take oil and gas and renewables. Every bit of renewables that we can get. It's not a matter of or, I think it's both and. I think by mid-century, 30% of our energy supply chain could be done by renewables and alternative energy. But that's a big change, and change historically has taken a long time to make happen. Sometimes 30 years to make a new energy source impact the market 1%. But to your particular question, Shell is investing in alternative and renewable energies. We've just, to your point in Brazil, Wendell, we've just did a JV with Cowen down there for $12 billion to generate first-generation biofuels as a way to lower emissions and renewables. And we're also one of the top 20 producers of wind in the United States. We have a wind business that is a growing business for Shell. So we are getting into the renewable business where it makes sense for Shell to get into the renewable business and where we think we can add value and help the equation.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for 4 questions, and I'm going to take one from each section, all right, to be fair. So I'm going to start over here, the gentleman right in the middle, and we're going to get a microphone. And then right here in the second row, if we could have a microphone here. Let me go right here in the third row, and then in the back, all the way in the back in that corner. So it's going to start over here as soon as you have the microphones. Just 2 provisos. Make your questions brief, and if you want, direct them to a single person or anyone on the panel other than the moderator. I have no answers. I just have questions.
I'm Jim Barry from Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute. This is a question for the Shell Oil person. You talked about alternative energy, but you didn't say much about carbon capture and storage. What are you doing with carbon capture and storage, and is that a viable option in your view for subseabed storage in addition to terrestrial geologic formations?
Carbon capture storage is certainly something Shell's involved with. In Canada is an area where we're working with it, as well as in Europe. As far as storing it offshore, we've looked at that in a number of cases. It is a viable process to do. It requires the right amount of equipment and the right kind of infrastructure to make it happen, and that infrastructure doesn't exist today. So there's a number of opportunities in this area. Shell, I should have mentioned it, Shell is also involved in doing CCS and trying to find ways to make that work in context to our normal business.
Okay, right here, please.
Hi, Amy.
Why don't you stand up so we can all see you and hear you?
Sure. Amy Christensen. Is this on? I have an advisory firm, and I'm also a Cato Fellow. Quick question also from Mr. Hollowell from Shell. Sorry about that. First of all,
2 down.
Given what's happening on the regulatory front following this accident, do you think it would have made a difference to have a truly robust, effective monitoring enforcement agency overseeing offshore drilling in the U.S.?
Lisa's listening.
I have. Yes.
No. There you go.
Let me say this. I'll speak to it from a Shell perspective, okay? Please, and that's all I can speak to it from a Shell perspective. Additional regulatory presence is not something that I, as a leader at Shell, I welcome it. Why do I say that? Because I think that the standards by which we drill wells and work in the Gulf of Mexico would be in concert with the regulations that are to come. Because I think in many cases you'll find that Shell already exceeds a lot of the standards, regulatory standards, just based on what we need to do as a Shell. And in fact, on the 22 recommendations from Secretary Salazar, Shell had already complied with the vast majority of those when they came out. So I'll answer the question that, I'll answer this, I am not afraid of that. I would welcome it, but I'm not afraid from the standpoint that I think it would be in concert with what I expect from a Shell design and a Shell well, and the way Shell drills.
Good, thank you, John. Okay, in this section right here. We have the microphones?
Yes.
Oh, boy, you're sly. You're sly, so I'm going to allow a fifth question because he had his hands up.
No.
Go ahead. And I'm not going to make you sit down. Go ahead.
Hazel Pelletro, I'm a private citizen from just outside Philadelphia, and this is for John. Why do you think for-profit companies so often insist on choosing the least expensive option, which leads to the most expensive disaster down the line in regard to human life or environmental damage, or both?
Boy. I'll have to answer that through a Shell lens because I don't believe we do that. I don't believe we sacrifice safety for profit. I'll tell you from deep water, I spend a lot of time making sure that the things that we do is safe. Safe first. If I cannot drill a well safe, I won't drill it.
Okay, right over here. Yes, sir.
I'm Matthis Wackernagel with Global Footprint Network, and my question is for Ms. Jackson.
Last.
And the question is quite simple.
I want to answer her question.
If we burned all the fossil fuel we have, oil, gas, coal, estimates say that we would go up to or even above 1,700 ppms. So why do we still need to find new oil?
Why do we still need to find new oil?
If all the oil we already have and gas and coal, if burned, would lead us to a 1,700 ppm world.
You know, the president, so I think your question is really, let me make sure I get what you're saying. Why are we still looking at depending on fossil fuel at all? Why does there need to be exploration? There is an entire sector of our economy that needs to gradually move to something different. That's economic reality. People do work in this field. People make their living in this field. Everything from how we get around to how we heat our homes to many of our factories are all based on fossil fuel. So a recognition by many of us that we need to transition to other energies that are more sustainable, that are better for our environment, that are better for our security, that are better all the way around is only the beginning of the story. I mean, what you're going to do over the next couple of days is talk about the story on a landscape that changes by the second. I mean, this is but one scene setter in our energy landscape. Another is what's happening in Washington. So my simple answer to your question is that any of what we do, whether it's coal mining or drilling, is going to mean still a transition, a gradual move away, because this economy, in the shape it's in, certainly the president's been clear, needs to move in a fashion that allows us to transition and needs to count on private sector investment. There's only so much public sector investment we can do, especially right now with strained government resources.
I don't want to put any pressure on the last person in the back row, but you have the last question. Make it a good one.
Thank you. My name is Lindsay Holmes. I am a Caddo Fellow, and I'm also a state representative in the Alaska State House. And this is mostly for Ms. Jackson, but Shell may also want to weigh in. Alaska, of course, is an oil and gas state. So we understand the upside. We also are the home of the Exxon Valdez oil spill, so we understand the downside, and we sympathize with the Gulf. I was wondering, with the moratoriums and the court cases, things are kind of going back and forth. We're in a lot of limbo right now, trying to plan at a state level for where our economy's going. Do you have any predictions or any advice for those of us at the state level moving forward? Thank you.
Well, first, I think state officials. First, you give me a great segue. I am leaving literally in 5 minutes. My staff are screaming at me to go to Alaska. And part of the reason is because I think it's vitally important in any type of regulation, protection schema that we incorporate local attitudes and also state governments and local governments. I'm actually going to spend a lot of time with Native Alaskan villagers and understand some of the issues they're dealing with. And then I think I'm going to go back and actually do the North Slope because it just didn't feel right to do it now. I think that for those of us who I used to work on the local level or the state level, it's vitally important to begin or to continue a dialogue that isn't based on knowing what the answer will be, but to engage the citizenry again and to trust the citizenry to be smart enough to draw conclusions on their own. I'm really careful about not drawing the conclusions for the people of the Gulf Coast, even though I have some history there. I haven't lived there in a long time. It's so important to hear from Wendell and people who are tell you, here's the conclusion we can draw for ourselves. People are smart enough to know, I think, that we're on an unsustainable course when it comes to fossil fuels. They're also smart enough to know that we can't turn the switch off even if we've been asleep at it. But I also think that they look for us as leaders in their government to reflect the knowledge that nothing will change until we build and educate all of us to look at another way, to be part of that. So,
I hope you all agree that Administrator Jackson and our other guests, Joel and Wendell and John, were fantastic. Please join me in thanking them.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you for moderating a wonderful panel. For those of you who have registered for the full 3-day forum and have one of these, please, you're welcome to join us for a reception over at Door Hosier through the door here. Also, if you are a registered forum pass holder, your agenda has many changes on it, so please watch the monitors and pick up an update because some of the sessions have moved, the times have moved, and you'll want to be aware of that starting tomorrow. Thank you.